Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today for the 2020 Charlottesville Women in Data Science Conference. Again, I'm Arlen Burgess. I'm the Associate Director for Operations and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Virginia School of Data Science. We are so excited you're here, and we have a great finish to the day, and we are excited to have you guys continue to engage with us. I wanted to touch base again just to remind everyone that we are staying engaged on social media, and we look forward to your questions. Our next speaker is going to be able to field questions in a Q&A after her keynote. So we do encourage everyone to submit your questions during the talk to hashtag 2020 Charlottesville WIDS, WIDS. And we will be fielding those questions and making sure that the speaker has the opportunity to answer them at the end of her talk. We want to thank again all of you for participating during the day, and thank again our sponsors, S&P Global, IBM, LMI, and Capital One. And we're really excited to finish out what has been a fantastic day. We hope that you guys have felt engaged and a part of this community, and we hope that this is going to be something that will continue on. So without further ado, to introduce our speaker, we have Vania from Capital One.
Thank you, Arlene. Hi. It's been great hearing from all the panelists. It's exciting to be here. I'm Vania Gonzalez. I'm a principal data scientist and machine learning engineer for the Center for Machine Learning at Capital One, which is an internal center for excellence in machine learning that works with lines of business as they develop and implement AI and ML systems. I have a PhD in particle physics and was an academic researcher before becoming a data scientist in the banking industry. Capital One is truly an innovative company that strives to improve the customer experience through technology. We leverage ML and AI innovations and solutions to develop a unique user experience for our Capital One customers, employing cutting-edge technologies and real human insights. Among the most common reasons to apply ML to business processes is the ability to perform certain functions at scale in an automated way, which would otherwise require vast amounts of time and resources. At Capital One, I am part of the development of a machine learning platform that turns algorithms into searchable, reusable, and scalable API endpoint solutions. And I'm also part of the lead on a time series-based anomaly detection at scale effort for our integration services extension. With that, I'm really excited to hear from our next presenter, Mutale Nkonde. Mutale Nkonde is the founding executive director of AI for the People, a nonprofit that seeks to use popular culture to educate Black audiences about the social justice implications of the deployment of AI systems in the public cloud. Prior to this, she worked as an AI policy advisor and was part of the team that introduced the Algorithmic and Deepfakes Accountability Acts, as well as the No Biometric Barriers to Housing Act on the House. She is currently considering a series of data privacy proposals. She is also the founder of the Dorothy Bang Tech Symposium, a briefing series that takes place on Capitol Hill. Nkonde is currently fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Tech and Society and was an 1819 fellow at Data and Society. Her work has been covered in MIT Tech Review, Wired, Venture Crunch, News, and PBS NewsHour, as well as being a co-author of a report on racial literacy and tech. And she speaks widely on race, policy, and AI. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mutale Nkonde. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, it's very surreal to meet you in this way, but it's exciting to meet you nonetheless. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes really speaking about my work in racial literacy, but much more specifically, how my work in technology and racial literacy has taken on new dimensions as we confront the coronavirus. As you heard, I am a technologist, social science, so looking at the way technical systems impact real people. I've done that for the last 8 years, starting my career at a nonprofit called Black Girls Code. And we worked with Google, we were their community partner, to really promote this idea that Black girls should and can be in tech. And many years later, moved into research and specific research on how technological systems and data science applications in real life impact Black communities. So without further ado, please pray for me because I want to make sure that this works, but we will get straight into it. So I really, as I thought, this talk was going to be something completely different 4 weeks ago when I was thinking about my slides to put together. But the events of the last 21 days have really brought us into conversation with the importance of the deployment of successful technologies in everyday life through this Keynote response. So this is a picture of Rosia Johnson-Stevenson. She was 65. It was taken from her Facebook page, and she unfortunately passed due to complications of the coronavirus in Atlanta earlier this week. So as we speak about the need for intersectional leadership, and what I mean by that is having not just women at the table, but having women who live at the multiple intersections of marginalized communities, whether that be race, whether that be gender expression, they may be women expressing, whether that be poverty, whether that be disability. The most unfortunate thing about Rosia's death was there, as I read news reports at her, there was speculation that had she had actually gone to try and get a test earlier and had been turned away. And had she have been a celebrity, had she have been white, had she have been somebody that was deemed more valuable as hospitals are making the decision who to test and who not to test, would she have received earlier treatment? And I want to keep that question out there as we think about the interplay between science, society, and the moment that we find ourselves in now. So my thesis is that Rosia, may she rest in peace, really was a victim of a much wider problem when it comes to not just Black women accessing medical care in the United States, but women, and then specifically Black women and girls more broadly, facing these barriers when it comes to getting into science in the beginning. And those are based on low expectations, not just low expectations because they're women in this conference. I'm sure that that's something that we've all felt at different points of our career, but also low expectations because she comes from a negatively racialized group. And one of the things that I did last year with my colleague, Jessie Daniels and Dirkshin Mer. Jessie Daniels is a sociologist at the City University of New York, and she has been studying the way white supremacist logics travel on the internet, really through chat rooms. So very early looking at Stormfront and others that were gaming social media platforms back in the early 90s to spread their messages. And Dirkshin Mer, who's a computer science professor at Bucknell University. And one of the concepts we were really interested in was this idea that becoming conversant in the way that race interplays with technology is a literacy. Much like learning to read, learning to write, learning to ride your bike. This is a literacy that can be learned and can be retained if we understand the key components. So we went to the work of Howard Stevenson, who is a psychologist at UPenn, who had been writing about this concept, but applying it to schools, teaching and learning. And we really wanted to know is this something that we could apply to technology first as being the scientific field, but as we can see from this story of Rosia Johnson, can we apply it as we think about science more broadly? And this is what we found. So racial literacy has three key components, which I'm going to discuss further in the talk. But just to give an overview, we discovered that racial literacy is cognitive. So it's knowing and understanding that our life experiences are differentiated depending on how we show up. So people that show up racialized as men are treated differently as those racialized as women. If we then start to think about intersections, then we're thinking about women who are also women and Black, or also women and disabled, or also women and either LGBT expressing, or people who are trans. Or people who are feminine, the women presenting, they would be treated differently also. But in this cognitive understanding, one of the things that we learn from the fields of psychology is sometimes these ideas that we know to be true in our brains and in our heads interact very negatively with our emotional understanding. So I'm on Twitter, pretty much on Twitter all the time. And there was a very similar story to Raisa's that showed up in the HuffPo UK newsfeed. For those who don't know, Black women having access to healthcare is an international problem. It's based on anti-Black racism, the idea that as Black women, we're not really sick, we're not really ill, is grounded in in the historical idea that Black people are not people. Therefore, to feel ill or to feel pain is a human experience and it's denied from us. And if we look at childbirth, that had been where much of the research had been going on. Black women who were at the brink of death, basically in childbirth and not getting treatment. And as we all know, or I should say, as I know, because I follow this news, Serena Williams actually spoke about this during the birth of her daughter, where there were some complications. And once she came out of that and she was safe, along with Alexis, thank God they're both safe, actually wrote about her treatment as not really feeling her pain in childbirth. But that is not something that people feel comfortable about that fact. So one of the things that happened in the newsfeed is that I commented on this story about the Black young woman dying in London in the same way Raisa did. And I'd said something like, it's so hard for Black women to access childcare, and in this to access healthcare. And in this moment of Corona, we're going to see this getting worse. And I got about 500 responses to that. And many of them were, this isn't happening. This isn't about race. You are crazy. You're making me feel bad. This isn't a thing, which I found to be really interesting as someone who has been a student of not just how do we talk about and communicate science, but how do we talk about and communicate science when it's telling stories about race, and maybe stories about race that we're not comfortable with. So the third part of racial literacy is, once we know that racism exists, and it exists as a real phenomenon for people who are negatively racialized in public life, and we know that this fact makes people uncomfortable, particularly people who think of themselves as not being racist, right? People who think about themselves as being fair-minded, and very often these people are white, they're socialized as white, and in the literature they're also often women. So white women who feel uncomfortable with this, how do we move away from the discomfort and towards the action? How do we move towards creating a racially just technological and scientific future? And that's really the question that I am answering right now. So
Mutale,
yep.
I apologize for interrupting, but we actually can't see your slides right now. So if you could just hit share screen.
Okay.
We've been able to keep up with your talk. So
just
hit share screen one more time. You all right?
Yeah, I'm so sorry, guys. Okay. Can you see them? Can you see them?
No, not yet.
Can you see them?
No, still can't see them.
Okay. So I am hitting, so it says that I'm sharing screen. I'm sharing it. Do you see that?
Oh, there we go. And if we could just put them on full screen. You're great.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, guys. So oh gosh, I'm nervous now. Okay. Can you guys see them?
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm so sorry, guys. Play pretend that you could see the others. So at this moment, one of the things that AI for the People have been charged with is thinking about ways that we can introduce this idea that racial literacy can be introduced into the corona response. Basically, because this is a human problem, and we have to make sure that the scientific questions that we're asking are going to benefit everybody. So, one of the briefs that I've been presented with is this idea of the masks. We are short of masks. I am based in New York City. We are currently ground zero for the coronavirus. As of last night, we had that says 20,000, we should actually say 200,000, I'm sorry, 20,000 confirmed cases. It's since gone up. We then need 50 million N95 single-use masks. That's the picture that you see on my right. And one of the things that's happened is that CD printing has been touted as a solution. So as I sit with these product teams, one of the questions that came to me was, who are these masks being created for? And the reason that I asked that prompt was, in this picture, they are creating this mask for a white man. But as we think about engineering solutions, we're obviously going to need to create a prototype of a face to put the mask on. And as we were thinking about that protocol, one of the things I had to really really remind the engineers around is the case study that we have around facial recognition technology. So in my introduction, you heard that I had worked on policy regarding facial recognition at the House level, the US House of Representatives. And one of the things that became really apparent to me while I was doing that work was, as you see in this picture, one of the reasons that facial recognition has failed to serve all people is that in order to recognize faces, what the algorithm does is to create a geometric model like the one that we're looking at here, where it's measuring distance between eyes, lip area, cheekbones, where are they situated, how long are they, distance also, we don't see it here, but often between ears and chin. And it does this through creating data sets of digital pictures where millions of faces are running through the database, and it comes out with ranges, normative ranges. So a man's face is, and then the geometric model, a woman's face is the geometric model. Skin color normatively is, and then it comes out, and then the system will then recognize new faces based on these predictions that have been made from the data set. And the reality of it was that those data sets, those normative skin, geometric models were failing to recognize Black and female faces. So this is Joy Bulawami. She is holding a white mask. She's a data scientist at MIT, and in 2018 did an initial study on facial recognition. The study happened quite by accident. She was working on a program and looking down at her computer and realized that the program could not recognize her while she was working. But when she held up a white mask, much like the one that she has in her hand, suddenly the program would begin to map the face. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that basically went viral and invited people like me into the field, because my interest is where technological systems interact with our understandings of race and racism, and came to find out that because the data set of the faces that were being used to build these systems were dominated by white men, that white men could be recognized by the systems that she was looking at 90% of the time. She went back last year, 2019, and ran the same test on Amazon's facial recognition software. And the reason that she had chosen recognition is that it was actually part of the software suite that was being used by law enforcement agencies like ICE to recognize who they should deport, and found the same again. So not only was it 90% in the 2000 test, when they went back, they found out that it was still 90% accuracy for white men. 40% of Black women were both misidentified and misgendered. And the reason that that happened was through the data sets that Recognition was using. Short hair was normative for male tagging within the system. So if we think about how pictures are labeled within MI systems, somebody that looks like Joy would actually be gendered male because of hair being one of the associated factors. And as she came out of that, Amazon as a company attacked her relentlessly. And this is why I'm putting forth in this talk this idea that this type of technological leadership has to be intersectional. Because what Bulawami was doing in her work was really just pointing out the science, pointing out that these systems did not work for everybody. She is not a politician. She is not somebody who was looking to make a broader point, but she did want to advance our understanding of how science is used, how science shows up for people from different groups. So when we go back to this idea of racial literacy as the model, and the slide, I hope the first slide that you guys saw, where I talked about the importance of the cognitive, this is what Bulawami was doing. But the attack that she got from Amazon was really an emotional attack. It was this idea that their product works, not just from a PR perspective, but they also, from the companies that they were working with, in this case, Palantir, really wanting to remain a good supplier to Palantir, they hit back. And one of the things that I'm suggesting is, as we are in a similar moment to facial recognition, as we start to create masks, and in order to 3D print these masks, we have to find out what normatively constitutes the faces of these first responders, and how can we make sure these masks fit correctly? Because the difference between a mask that fits correctly and a mask that has been optimized to fit a large white man, for example, it could be life and death, as we think about the coronavirus being one that is transmitted through close contact. So when I'm talking about intersectional leadership, one of the things I'm asking data scientists to do is to really acknowledge that you guys hold the science. You can do all the math in the world, and that's extremely important, but also include people that understand not just how race shows up in technology, and we know that it shows up at the design stage, but also the implications of making a decision that could ultimately, in the case of the N95 masks, be the difference between whether women first responders contract this at higher rates than male first responders, and or if women who are coming from a different phenotypical group, that could be in the context of masks, that could be perhaps wider measurements from the nose through to the cheekbone for some ethnic groups. Can we make sure that we have solutions that are not one fits all, but acknowledge there are lots of different people in our society? And that's the emotional piece. So when we went to the literature, one of the best practices that was suggested, and one of the best practices I would love to suggest to this room, is when we're thinking about designing these technological systems, one of the things that I would love people to do is to just take a measure of how they feel if and when they are asked, is this an equitable technology? Is this going to have racial implications? Because one of the things that we found in the survey, one of the things that we found in the Advancing Racial Literacy report that I co-authored last year, was when we talked to male VPs of engineering in tech firms, they were extremely defensive, much like the Amazon folks to Joy. They wanted to shut down the conversation. They often told us that race isn't a factor in computer science, and that they would rather use the word diversity because it was much easier for their teams. And what the research actually says is that you figure out how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10. And if you are at an 8, you are probably thinking emotionally. You're not thinking about solving problems. Bring yourself to a 5, which is uncomfortable. You're not feeling great. This isn't your territory, but you can engage in this idea that technological systems have different impacts for different people. And unlike Joy, who was attacked, you can actually come to the table and potentially ask more questions, because in the defense of Amazon, where they have particularly served women well in terms of equitable technology, was their decision to not use an algorithm, artificial intelligence system that was sorting female resumes out of recruitment pools because it was optimized. It had optimized itself to show preference for the words men and male. And as a result, people with words like, phrases like men's chess team, or if we're thinking about colleges, Morehouse is a historically Black male college versus Spelman, its sister college. They would have then sorted the man from Morehouse above the woman from Spelman. And what Amazon did in that particular instance was acknowledge that there was a problem in their algorithm, and they took it off the market, pending further research, which would be a best practice. But when this issue of race came up, it was very emotional. So then the last part of racial literacy that we found were, in order to fix this problem, you have to have action plans. So we know that creating human-based solutions, we think about them typically in terms of biometrics, facial recognition, language processing, gait recognition. But in this moment of Corona, where we have this very explicit problem of creating the N95 masks and then making sure that as these masks are deployed, they will adequately fit the faces of every responding in the emergency room, whether you are a tall white man, a short Black woman, a middle-sized Asian non-binary person. And all of these are significant because our facial graphs are going to have different dimensions. How do we achieve this? So I tend to be a Debbie Downer for many things. I think when I come through the room, people sigh, but they know that I'm bringing, they know that I'm saying, you can do it. We just have to think differently. One of the things that I would like to put forward is, in this Corona moment where we're going to be where engineers and data scientists are going to be asked to come in and literally create the tools that we need to get to a new future, we start to think about ourselves in the public interest. So I describe myself as a public interest technologist. Public interest technology is a relative. It was announced in the New York Times actually last year. So for people that have graduated in the audience, like me, it did not exist when we were around, but it's modeled on the same ideas as public media and public interest law. And that is that as we go out and practice, as well as thinking about innovation and profit, which are certainly two things that happen in the industry sector, we also think about, is this technological solution that we're creating, we're deploying, or we're governing in the interests of the most impacted in society, the most marginalized. And I think in this moment where, because of Corona, we're seeing how our systems have largely failed us, this actually presents an opportunity to be truly intersectional. So going back to that specific design brief that I was presented with around creating masks that are going to fit the faces of our first responders, one of the action points I would love for us to think about collectively is when we're off quarantine, when we're back into society, can we, in our work, find ways to center equity in the engineering process? So, what does that mean? Well, going back to the Joy Bulawami story, it means acknowledging upfront that the solutions that we're creating, particularly if they're solutions that are then going to make decisions for people's lives. So in the banking industry, you might be developing a an application for loans. I've spoken extensively about facial recognition, but we could also think about if you're developing algorithms that in the criminal justice system are going to decide right now who is going to be kept in jail and who's not. That's actually a problem that the mayor of New York is looking at. And what they're doing is that they're using bail predictive instruments to try and predict who'll commit crimes if we let them out during this self-quarantine moment and who won't. And there is literature to say that Black defendants are going to be impacted by staying in jail more than white. So can you be that canary in the coal mine? I'm so sorry. The perils of working from home. Can you be that canary in the coal mine to say, well, this technology, like this application, is going to hit different people differently? That would be an example of being in the public interest. In our teams, how can we find people within our teams who may do that work? So in my career, I have typically been the person that has brought up issues of equity. And that's mainly because I was a Black woman working in a big tech company. It was very evident to me that there were so few people that looked like me that there really had to be a reason for that, which wasn't about the pipeline, right? We hear that there are not enough women in college, there are not enough Black people in college, we don't know how to hire them. Well, I can say certainly at places like Google, they have the freedom to hire liberally, very widely. So I had colleagues who who had backgrounds in art history and anthropology and in sociology and working on product teams because those insights were needed. So as we think about this moment, what skills, as opposed to qualifications, do we need on these teams as we face these different problems that Corona has brought us, many of which are going to fall on the shoulders of engineers, the shoulders of data scientists to create solutions? Can we be teams? Can we be the type of leaders that are going to say, I don't need the person from MIT, I need the person who knows how to use a 3D printer at scale and can create 50,000 units overnight? That type of skill is something that could come potentially from lived experience, but may not necessarily have been taught at MIT. Not that there's anything wrong with MIT. I'm sure the people know how to make all the masks all the time, but that would be an example of that. And then the third point, and this is kind of tongue-in-cheek because it is kind of for people like me, think about teams. In order to be in the public interest, there have to be mechanisms by which the team has people like me who are thinking about social science, who are thinking about real world impacts and are not thinking about code and are not thinking about the business case, in conversation with data scientists, in conversation with business folks, in conversation with UX people, in order to create what I think could be a more just technological future. And one of the opportunities and one of the cries I feel like this moment has given us broadly, but very much in this design moment that I've had around the N95 masks, is the opportunity to be better. And I cannot help but wonder if the research from the business community that says when you have when women are invested in the startup industry, those companies tend to be more successful. They tend to have a higher yield. They tend to have less turnover. I would go far as saying, in order for us to come through this moment and come through this moment successfully, we need the wisdom of women. We need to be like the Mariah Curies of this moment. And for those who don't know, Mariah Curie, she is touted in the cancer research world for helping develop treatment for terminal cancers. The way she came across that innovation was she was at home, and she had noticed that when she was cleaning, there were certain parts of where she cleaned that bacteria didn't grow. She isolated that, and then from that case study was able to be part of the first team that was looking at cancer treatment drugs. And now you'll find that many cancer charities are named after her. But she pioneered using the lived experience of being a woman. She pioneered because she had these other knowledges. So what happens when we build teams that are not just multidisciplinary in terms of discipline, but also have life experiences that can teach us what it actually means? For example, in the facial recognition world, what does it mean to be surveilled? What does it mean to be surveilled, and what are the implications of freedom for racialized populations? Or in this new problem, if we don't think intersectionally, and if we don't acknowledge that women first responders are going to have different needs, what's that going to mean in terms of survival rates for those women? So in closing, I'm actually shorter than I expected to be, but I'm hoping that means that we can have a much longer conversation. But in closing, one of the things that I would say to you in this moment of Corona, where the answer to our social problem has to be a scientific one, I would urge you all to think about the intersections. Think about the strengths that you to your teams. You are women in data science. And then also extend that thought and extend that grace and think about the Black science, Latinx scientists, non-conforming scientists, disabled scientists are going to bring those insights through lived experience that will help us create these solutions that will get us to a more just technological future. Because if we cannot think in this moment big, and if we cannot be bold, then we will all be screwed. So thank you for listening. I appreciate you, and I'm hoping in questions you will have more, you can help me think more about these N5 masks. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mutale. It's great to hear from you. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to do some questions and answers. I must say we've heard a few ambulances going by and emergency vehicles going by there in New York. So please stay safe, and you know that we're all thinking about you. We know that that's a difficult place to be right now. So please take care of yourself too. So I've got a couple questions that have come in. Again, people in the audience, please Send your questions through hashtag 2020 Charlottesville WIDS. But maybe we'll kick off with something actually about here at the School of Data Science. We have a focus on ethics, and the potential ethical implications of data science is something that is at the core of what we do. And because of that, there's often the question of like, okay, where's the checklist? Right? Can I have the checklist so that I can have the ethical stamp of approval to move this forward? So knowing that we're in a time when people are trying to act so quickly, right? COVID is here, it's now. In a time when people are trying to act so quickly, how can we avoid that checklist model and still give people the resources and the opportunity to really think about these kinds of things during this crisis?
That's an excellent question, and it's something that comes up for me in my work. Like, Mutale, we love your work, we love your reports. Give us a checklist, we'll do it, and then we'll be fine. Unfortunately, and I think we're seeing this in COVID, this is a moving target. No checklist would have been able to, and I'm centering COVID in my responses just because I'm so obsessed with this design brief that I've been given. But this is a moment where we have to think broadly, and we have to be dexterous in our responses. So I would say two things. I think the checklist is a great starting point. I think it's a great starting point because it at least lets you know that you're thinking about what could go wrong. For example, with their hiring algorithm, that worked fine. It really worked fine until they looked around and they said, all our senior engineers are men. And that is not in line with our values as a company anymore. How do we get more women in? And it was through that type of questioning, there was some type of culture shift that happened, right? That our value as a company is that we have more senior women are more representative in these ranks. So I would say that the way to move away from checklist thinking is moving towards what kind of technologist do you want to be? What kind of values do you want to ensure? What kind of companies? I'm at Harvard this year, and I also actually have a fellowship at Stanford. And what's really interesting when I'm speaking to undergraduate engineers at both those schools is that they're saying, well, we don't want to go and work for companies that are going to create drones that are then going to be used in war to kill kids in Syria, for example. Very specific, but it's been said. And that's about values. And I would suggest at this moment where our lives are so different that the way to move away from checklist thinking is to think about what kind of impact is this skill set going to have in the world, and then look for places that align with your values.
I think that's great. I think that's great. Got a question coming in here. The CDC and Johns Hopkins and a handful of other institutions are the primary sources of data that all of us are using to understand the spread of COVID-19. But these data do not include race or gender. And it may be months before we have enough data to understand health disparities of this crisis. What would you think are the research questions we should be asking and the data we should be trying to collect in order to complete the picture we have of COVID-19's impact and the spread?
Wow. That's, I mean, whoever said that, call me afterwards because you're clearly brilliant. I don't know enough about this as I offer a response. But one of the things, just looking at the way that this has spread in this country, because we don't have testing, I don't know how we would even begin to ask the questions. Because right now, it seems that if you are a celebrity, you are much more likely to be positive. Going on the news, right? Just the people that are showing up to be positive. But what that actually says, that's more about the people that have access to testing and the people that don't have access to testing. So I think in terms of research questions, I would just want to know how this originated. and what were the circumstances that led to patient one. I was reading in the Times this morning that they think that they've isolated the first patient in Wuhan. And he was, unfortunately, he's passed away. May he rest in peace. He was a vendor, a fish vendor. I believe it was shrimp that he sold. And he sold it outside in market conditions. I would want to know, from a research perspective, what were the conditions in that market that gave rise to this, and where did it originate? In terms of race and gender, in terms of race and gender, I think those were the two. My hypothesis is that this is a virus that requires travel, and it requires mass mobility within populations, which is why New York City, for example, is an issue, and density. New York City, we have a subway system that everybody is on all the time, so we're traveling all the time. It's very much socialized. We're traveling together, and then we're close to each other. There's 8 million of us. So I with the little that I know, I don't know whether race and gender are necessarily what I would look at first. I'm much more interested in environmental issues. And then within that, if we were to look at race and gender, we can't look at race and gender and disease without looking at access to healthcare, which isn't a hard scientific. That's where social scientists would come out. So I imagine seeing questions like differential impact of COVID-19 between population X, and if we're talking Johns Hopkins, population X in Baltimore versus population Y outside of Baltimore, which is a more affluent, more white environment.
Well, the person that asked that question is our Associate Director for Research Development, Claudia, and I will attest to the fact that she is, in fact, brilliant. And so, yes, indeed. And actually, so a question that actually follows up on what you were just saying is, based on what you've seen so far, and anecdotal evidence, knowing that that's a lot of what we're dealing with right now, do you have an idea of what communities you believe might be disproportionately impacted by this virus? And do you suspect that inequality is going to be a primary factor in that?
Yeah, I think so from what we're seeing, and this is really literally me watching Cuomo, like I'm so obsessed with these press conferences, and I rewatch them and I watch them. So I'm just putting that out there. This is my primary source. I think from what I'm sensing, so our ground zero is Queens in New York. And Queens is a really interesting borough because it's the most diverse borough in the whole of the city. So within a city that is extremely diverse, we have, I think they said 200 different types of ethnic groups that live in this one place. And the hospital where we had 13 fatalities yesterday serves pretty much all of these different types of people. I think what we're going to see are the people that the people that were, and then the other part of that fact pattern is people are waiting up to 4 days in Queens, standing in lines for up to 12 hours a day, right next to each other. They're not social distancing. They just want to know if they're sick or not. They're coughing all over each other to get these tests. So I do think that inequality is going to be a factor because people that could get tested earlier and then self-isolate and really have even the peace of mind are, in my opinion, going to have better outcomes than some of the working class people that we're seeing in Queens who are standing outside for 4 days to try and get this testing. And they're not self-isolating because they're in panic. I also think that one of the things that we're definitely going to see are this conversation around underlying issues. I am not a public health, I'm not a medical doctor, but there seems to be some conflict. And this goes back to what research questions. One of the research questions I hope extent did having an underlying issue into people dying or not. So Raisa Johnson, I started my talk with, you couldn't see the slides, I'm so sorry. There were no mention of underlying issues in that particular story. It doesn't mean that that was correct. It just means that it wasn't reported. And so I wonder whether access to healthcare generally is going to become part of this. Because if you're someone who has lupus, but you don't have the healthcare to treat it, and then you're standing in the line in Elmhurst for 4 days with this disease, how much was your prior social making worse? So, and homeless people, housing, ability to have housing impacts health outcomes. So I think it will be, but this is all anecdotal.
Any thoughts about possible cultural disparities? For example, religious communities that are discouraging their members from social distancing practices.
So that's really interesting. I go to a Black church here in Brooklyn, New York. We've always been considered like a hoity-toity church. So if I know when I first moved here, I joined because I grew up in a small town in the suburbs in the UK. My parents were terrified that I was going to live in. They thought I was going to get mauled by a gang day one. So go and find the nice people. So I went to this church because somebody that went there was a really prominent New York Times writer. And I was like, oh, let me go there. We have been having online services for the last 13 years that I've been at this church. So it was really easy for us to go online. All it meant was that instead of the pastor saying, don't stay in bed and go to Bedside Baptist, come and fellowship with the congregation, we already had an AV ministry. We already had everything set up. The church that my friend goes to is a much, much more traditional church that is very, very reliant on people gathering. And she told me that last Sunday, and we had a stay-at-home order here in New York, they showed up because they felt that praying and having faith in God would be one of the ways to combat this. And one of the other projects that AI for the People are working on is a disinformation project. And we're looking at the failures of climate communication and how the scientists were never really able to get their message out, and what real world impact that has. And I suspect we're going to see the same with Corona, where if you are from a cultural group, a religious group that really does not believe that this is serious. I mean, we're seeing in Virginia that Liberty University is opening soon. They don't believe, they're just like, Corona, Ramona, this just comes to school. But that's really dangerous. That's not scientifically sound. So I do think that we are going to have these pockets of people that just do not believe science is real generally. And those people will end up being really impacted. And we've seen it with some of the young people that were out on South Beach and saying it wasn't a real thing. And then the news goes and follows up with those same young people, and they've actually contracted and tested positive.
Got a question from the dean of the School of Data Science. And he says, we are a new and versatile school here at the School of Data Science at UVA. And what would you think is the singular most important thing we could do as a team, which involves research scientists, people that are, faculty, students, all of us that are working to try and make this thing go? What could we do as a team to address the inequalities you highlighted during this pandemic?
Well, one of the things that I will definitely say about your school, and shout out to everybody that emailed me, tweeted at me, got into my DMs from the school who are saying, I'm an international student. I see that you're coming. I'm a Black woman. I see that you're coming. It seems to me that there is something in your recruitment practices that has made this particular department accessible. So I would really look at what that was and dig into that. The second part, and this is not something that I could tell from the tweets or I could tell from the outreach, And I was hoping to meet a bunch of people on campus actually while I was there, just because I wanted to hear their stories. Like, how did you end up in Virginia? How did you end up in Charlottesville? Like, after 2015, you're still there? Like, what's going on? And they were like, no, it's great. One of the things that I would then be really interested in, and I think that as a team, you could possibly do, is look at the experiences for those students that you've been able to reach out to, and then think about ways that you can make them inclusive. So when we were looking at the racial literacy in tech report, which I'm happy to share, I don't know if it will be helpful or not, as we were speaking to, so we spoke to VPs of engineering, we also spoke to diversity and inclusion folks in the same company, and it was an ethnography. And we found out on the engineering side, there was the idea that race wasn't an issue. It doesn't matter in their team. This is technology. We're not going to address it. But when we spoke to the diversity and inclusion folks, they were saying, well, junior engineers from those teams of color are struggling because they can't get their ideas heard, or when they raise these issues, they don't have the power to influence the technology. So even though in my talk, I was saying, public interest, developing technologists who think in the public interest is a strategy, I think that could be a really good entry point. I don't know whether UVA is part of the Public Interest Technology University Network. I can share that information, but it's run through the New America Foundation, and they look for technology departments that are really wanting to put engineers out into the world that are going to be able to do good. Whatever that looks like. And I think maybe being in conversation with some of those schools. I know both Stanford, I know the program I'm on through Stanford, they're a grantee, and I know that Berkman Klein are both. And I think that their vision is to make sure that all engineering schools across the country have this public interest leaning. So those are really, I think, those are really good places to start, because if you can create a home and a brand by school that not only has a diverse student body, I don't know how diverse or not it is, but certainly the people that reached out to me were from those communities, and then you meet them where they are, and then you have support of New America and Ford and MacArthur and all of these other people that are standing up this, it could be really useful.
Yes, and UVA is a part of that public interest technology network, and I think that's great. And we have several departments and schools we are trying to work together, and I think that's great. And the more that message is put out there of, when we do bring these kinds of people together, the conversations are even more effective. Which leads me to the next question of having that social science view and having sometimes maybe being the outsider in some of the conversations, the technical conversations. What do you do? Thinking about maybe a student that is getting ready to graduate, that is interested in being a part of these conversations, that may not have all the technical expertise, but is interested in being a part of those conversations and believes that they have something to really add. How do you add yourself to those conversations and really make sure that your voice is heard? What advice would you have for them?
You have to look for the gaps. So I always tell people that I fell into technology. My underlying, I'm a sociologist by training, but I had always been interested in science communication. So prior to coming to the US, I'd worked for the BBC, which is our major broadcaster, a public interest broadcaster, public media. We have a different setup, but I had been in charge of our scientific programming. So the edict that we had was, people in the UK really didn't believe climate change, and we needed to stop. We needed to develop programming that would promote that, but they also didn't understand. What was the first thing I worked on? Antibiotic resistance and how it was bleeding through food, which sound really boring things, but they gave me great skills, because it meant that from the very beginning of my career, I was speaking to research scientists and I was speaking to academic scientists about their work and helping them translate their work to the general public. So whether that was policymakers, whether it was the person on the street, that was how I found my way in. For people, and that was really my superpower. My superpower has throughout my career been the ability to take an academic paper, and then if I can make a congressional staff understand it, then you can make anybody understand it, particularly if you're talking about things like algorithms, you're talking about neural networks, you're talking about face graphs. Because when I was talking to them about facial recognition, they were like, what? The machine takes a picture of your face and then it draws a hexagon on it. And I was like, no, but yes, but if and that was my way in. So you may not be a communicator, but one of the things that I think sociologists and anthropologists are very good at is finding out the stories of how do these technologies impact end users. So one of when I was doing the work with Google, I was so surprised how many people were working in UX, right? User experience is not a hard engineering feature, but what many of those people were doing, and I'm speaking about the customer experience people, not the people building the product. What those people were doing were interviewing people as they tested out the product. So figure out what training you have that will head the science forward, because one of the things that all scientists, no matter what their discipline, understand and want is to create a new way of doing something. And they are going to need an audience for that, or whether it's a user, if you're in business, or whether it's a policymaker. And we're seeing tech companies now as regulation is coming through, policymakers have become an unexpected audience. Or whether it's just making sure I know how to use Zoom, which clearly I don't because I didn't share my slides. But there are always ways to serve those audiences, and they're important. I was at Google. 50% of people at Google are non-technical. 50%. They could not have a company every was creating Gmail.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a musician by training, so I certainly understand that, and I think that one of the most amazing things when I was the first full-time hire of the Data Science Institute before we became a school more than almost 6 years ago now, and I think that it was one of the first. It was one of the things that that the people that were involved were excited about with me as a candidate, because I was sort of a proof of concept, right? So I was talking to engineers who had this idea, and all of a sudden here was a musician who knew a little bit about data and a little bit about statistics and was excited about what data science could do for the world. And well, if this musician believed it was really a thing, then maybe it really was. So I'm a huge advocate for that. I think that's great. Let's see, I've got one more question for you, and then we'll see if anything else comes up on Twitter. But what do we think about what would you see as the role and perhaps even the obligation, and would you use that word, of a data scientist in bringing things forward to inform policy? So when a data scientist discovers something that could inform policy, what is the obligation of that data scientist to bring that forward?
So I would say, and I'm speaking specifically to women, because men don't ask that question. They just bombard you with their ideas. But I would say the obligation of women cannot be understated. So Dorothy Vaughan, who I named the briefing series after, was the first African-American woman to use the IBM Watson computer. And she's memorialized in the movie Hidden Figures. And the reason that she retrained her unit was she was beginning to see how technology was changing at NASA. and wanted to make sure that the mathematicians that she worked with, who were called computers, I mean, computers were humans, right? They weren't machines, that were called computers, would still be economically viable. She went and learned how to program this machine. So she's the first programmer. I always think of Dorothy Vaughan as a future of work figure, and she was operating in the 1950s. She was a Black woman. She had all of these barriers against her, but had she had the access at that point, I want to save the women I work with in my unit, but I do think that the world is going to be a technical place, and then have that conversation. I think it could have been incredibly powerful. Was cancelled, but on March 3rd, I believe, there was at Stanford, we're having women in data science. And one of the breakout sessions that they had were, how can women become more conversant in this policy? And the reason they were interested in me was when I was looking at deepfakes Accountability Act, one of the things that I pointed out in my briefings were how audiovisual manipulation, particularly deepfake technology, which for those who don't know, the ability to take a face and body graph of a visual and then take, I think it's now down to 5 seconds of their audio, and then create a natural language processing, as well as the false representation of them, and put them in a place doing something that they've never done. And the way that was showing up was porn, and it was white women. It was this relentless attack on many of the white women were famous, but when we looked at the data set, it's also just women on the street. And because they were using your picture, they didn't need to know you. So this wasn't a revenge porn situation where you take an intimate picture and then they put it on the internet. People were able to go onto social media pages, scraping them off the internet, and then creating this violence against women. And I thought, the computer scientists I worked with on that particular piece of legislation, and I always work with computer scientists on all my projects, is a woman called Brandeis Marshall, who is a professor of computer science at Spelman College in Atlanta. But it had been very hard to find her. And the reason that I needed a computer scientist on that panel is it's great for people like me, legal practitioners, social scientists, to advocate for faces of technology, but ultimately the credibility lies with the actual data scientist. And so many of these technologies are weaponized against women, or in the case of facial recognition, I concentrated very heavily on women, but these systems also do not recognize white women. To have those expertise in the room attached to a group of people who understand and feel threatened by that same problem is so compelling when it comes to what I would consider positive change, what other people may consider change. It's critically important. I would really encourage female data scientists to consider themselves as worthy and important. And I would say that you probably understand some of the social impacts in a much more real way than your male colleagues. Ultimately, it's your resume that's being pushed out of the data set, right? It's the idea that you could be pornified and I think that's incredibly compelling.
I think that's great. And I think it's great to acknowledge the questions that sometimes we ask as women, as you said, that don't even make it to the thought process in other conversations.
And also shameful. I think with the Deepfakes Accountability Act, we really searched very long to find a woman that was impacted by that. it was sensitive, and it kind of, I spoke about racial literacy having this emotional component, but I also think that with gender there is this component where we're seen as weak, or we're not seen as real, we're not seen as real experts when we're in the development phase. Like, that may not play well at Google, but it certainly plays well in Congress. It certainly plays well in state houses. It certainly plays well in other, in other environments.
Mm-hmm. And even in a time now where COVID is having the messages stay home, right? And the question is, for those where home is not the safe place to be, and or home is not a place at all, and how are we, just thinking about all of the different people and the way that they interpret
Right.
those kinds of messages.
And that actually adds to an early message around how will inequality play out. I would be really interested to see whether those of us that have stable housing, and by stable, I mean you literally have a roof over your head, but then within that roof, you feel safe and secure, versus those who don't. And I think that that's going to play out in New York, because we're a city of 8 million, 4 million of us are going to contract COVID before the fall. It's going to happen. So my prayer for myself is that I contract it, I'm asymptomatic, I get the antibodies, it's somehow identified, I can then donate plasma so that we can figure out how to fight this, right? That's my ideal, or I don't, but I'm in New York, so let's just, let's go with the math, let's go with the science. I probably will. I have a much higher likelihood of being successful with that, because I live in a house that I can afford. It's safe, it's clean. I like everybody in my household, and we do happy dances every day because we're not on respirators. So we have all of these rituals around joy and happiness because we're safe. I wonder whether there is some type of link with your immune system and your feeling of emotional stability. And I think that would be, I don't know how I would measure that, but I think that would be a really interesting thing. And I hope that through that data, we can then advocate to protect people, but most of the people that are vulnerable are going to be women in vulnerable positions should this happen again.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a great way for us to wrap up, right? To think about, I hope that this day and this conference and this feeling of connectedness to people, you and I are living hundreds of miles apart, and being able to have this conversation and be able to put it out to the world. I hope that this kind of connectedness brings some of that joy to people in a time where isolation sometimes makes that very difficult. So we cannot thank you enough, Mutale, for joining us, for sticking with us, even though we had to go to this different format. We really wish you the very best. Please do stay safe and healthy. And fear not, we will be asking you to come down to Charlottesville at some point.
I would love to.
We would love to have you. Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, and just think about Raisa Johnson, and just think about how her family can't see her, and how she tried to get access to healthcare, but because of a lack of intersectional thinking, she wasn't prioritized. And I hope that we can collectively I hope that women will come together and say collectively that it was not good enough then, and it won't be good enough in the future. And as we come out of this, we need a seat at the table, because men shouldn't be and cannot do this work alone. And this is not a moment for blame, but this is a moment to rethink about who's important in society, who's not important in society, who do we depend on? And it's a bunch of women in hospitals who are not just the doctors and nurses, but also cleaning and making sure that those environments are sterile. and they're the heroes, right now.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mutale.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Great. And to wrap up, everyone, thank you so much for what has been a fantastic day, a great opportunity for us to come together, be connected, to hear from some really fantastic women that are leading the way in data science, and for getting the opportunity to take our current life situation when all of us are just in a very strange place, and really being able to think about how we can utilize data science to help move the world forward in this time. I hope that this has been a day of connectedness, and I hope that, as we were discussing right there at the end of Mutale's talk, that you take that connectedness and you allow it to bring you joy. You continue these conversations, and you connect with your colleagues, with your friends, with people on social media. Connect with us at the School of Data Science. We can't wait to hear from you. And we will be sending out a survey to those that have registered for this conference. And we would love to hear from you about the impact that this event had on you, and how we can continue to keep this conversation going. If you didn't register, and you didn't have to in order to get involved in the live stream, and you want to send us some comments, we'd love to hear from you. Please just email datascience@virginia.edu, and we'd love to hear about everything that you have to say about our event here today. A huge, unbelievable thank you to our sponsors that have made this possible: S&P Global, IBM, LMI, and Capital One. You heard from all of them today. They're doing outstanding work, and they really are a part of how we were able to make this possible, both in its previous format, and then pivoting to make this possible in this virtual format as well. And also to our speakers who really jumped onto the train and said, absolutely, we're ready to do this. We can figure out Zoom, and we're ready to move it forward. Most importantly, we have to thank our comms team. Danielle DeAndrea has just done a monumental amount of work to make this possible in such a short amount of time. So especially big thank you to Danielle. Again, tweet at her, send her a message, send her an email, and tell her how much you appreciate her. The whole comms team: Cody Huff, Meg Evatt, Connor, and Melissa, Claudia, who helped with our research highlights, and Benaz, Wendell with our corporate engagement, and the whole data science team. Thank you all. And thanks to the Global Women in Data Science Conference for really bringing this conversation to the forefront. We're excited to be a regional event of Global WIDS, and we're excited to always be able to offer this content as a part of that connection. I wish all of you the best. We're at 4:59. I hope you go have, enjoy a nice cocktail hour and a reception. Stay engaged, have a conversation on Twitter. Wash your hands, stay home, be gracious to your family, your colleagues, and most importantly, to yourself. Remember to always be an advocate for yourself, and advocate for those people who are not able to advocate for themselves. In this time when, again, we're just living in a very difficult and strange world, we want to use data science to make the world a better place. And so we hope that you'll stay connected with us at the University of Virginia School of Data Science. We are hiring fantastic people to come and move things forward. So if that's of interest to you, please get connected with us. I hope that you all have a fantastic weekend, although weekends feel a little bit different than they normally do, and stay healthy and safe, and stay connected with us and your colleagues. And thank you so much. Bye.